The small creature moved through the rain-soaked streets with a purpose that seemed impossible for something so fragile. Its paws, barely larger than silver dollars, struck the pavement in a rhythm that spoke of desperation rather than play. Behind it, 20 yards back, walked Officer James Andy, a 10-year veteran of the Oakland Police Department who had seen enough in his career to think nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. What this tiny animal was about to reveal would shatter every assumption he held about loyalty, intelligence, and the unbreakable bonds that exist between species. Before we continue, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The November storm had descended upon Oakland like a living thing, transforming familiar streets into rivers of debris and forgotten dreams. Andy sat in his patrol car, watching sheets of water cascade across the windshield, distorting the neon signs of closed shops into abstract paintings of light and shadow. The radio crackled with routine calls, a fender bender on 4th, a domestic dispute on Lumi, nothing that required his immediate attention. His shift was nearly over, and the thought of his empty apartment, with its bare walls and single chair facing a television that rarely worked, filled him with the kind of weariness that sleep could never cure. The movement caught his eye almost by accident, a splash of golden fur against the gray concrete, moving with determination through puddles that would have swallowed most creatures its size. Andy leaned forward, squinting through the rain-blurred glass. A puppy, he realized. Golden retriever, maybe 8 or 9 weeks old. Soaked to the bone and shivering violently. But it wasn't wandering aimlessly like a lost animal should. It was moving with purpose, stopping every few yards to look back, as if checking to see if anyone was following. Andy felt something stir in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in the 3 years since his daughter had stopped speaking to him. He told himself it was just a professional obligation. The city had ordinances about stray animals, procedures to follow. But as he stepped out of the patrol car, rain immediately soaking through his uniform, he knew it was something more. The puppy had stopped beneath a broken streetlight, its small body trembling with more than just cold. When it saw Andy approaching, it didn't run. Instead, it took 3 steps toward him, then 3 steps back, then forward again, performing a dance of urgency that made Andy's trained instincts flare to life. Something was wrong. Animals didn't behave this way without reason. Andy approached slowly, his hand extended, in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. The puppy watched him with remarkable focus for such a young creature, its brown eyes tracking his every movement. When Andy was close enough to touch, the puppy surprised him by not seeking comfort or warmth. Instead, it grabbed the hem of his pants leg with tiny teeth and pulled, then released and ran 10 feet ahead before stopping to look back. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. Andy's 15 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, even when they defied logic. He had learned this lesson in blood and consequence, in the nights when he had ignored that whisper in his mind and arrived too late, and in the moments when he had listened and saved lives he would never know the names of. The puppy was trying to communicate something, and every fiber of Andy's being told him it was important. The chase began in earnest then. The puppy moved through the rain-slicked streets with surprising speed, its small legs working furiously to maintain distance between itself and the officer. Andy followed, his boots splashing through puddles, his radio bouncing against his hip. They passed shuttered storefronts and empty parking lots, moving steadily away from the main thoroughfares into the industrial district, where legitimate businesses gave way to forgotten warehouses and abandoned dreams. The puppy never hesitated, never paused to sniff at interesting scents or investigate potential food sources. Its focus was absolute, its destination clear in whatever passed for consciousness in that small, determined mind. Andy's breathing grew heavier as they continued, not from exertion but from a growing sense of dread. The industrial district was where bad things happened, where bodies turned up, where drug deals went wrong, where the city's darkness pooled like oil in neglected corners. "Where are you taking me?" Andy muttered, though he expected no answer. The puppy glanced back, and in that moment, Andy could have sworn he saw something like relief in those brown eyes, as if the animal understood that help was finally coming. But help for what? The warehouse loomed before them like a monument to decay. Its windows were broken teeth in a crumbling face, and rust had consumed the metal siding until it resembled diseased skin more than industrial architecture. Andy had patrolled past this building 100 times without giving it much thought. Just another corpse in a district full of them, waiting for the city to scrape up enough money for demolition or for developers to see potential in the rot. The puppy stopped at a side entrance, a small door that hung crooked on broken hinges. It began to dig at the base of the door, its tiny paws scraping against concrete and rust, leaving small streaks of blood that the rain quickly washed away. The sight of that blood made something twist in Andy's gut. The animal was hurting itself in its desperation to get inside, but it wouldn't stop. It couldn't stop. Andy pulled out his flashlight and radio. Protocol dictated he call for backup before entering an abandoned building, especially in this neighborhood where squatters and drug manufacturers often set up operations in forgotten spaces. But something about the puppy's urgency made him hesitate. If someone was in trouble inside, if time was the difference between life and death, then waiting for backup might be the wrong choice. He had made that mistake once before, followed protocol while a man bled out 3 rooms away, and the sound of those final gurgling breaths still visited him in dreams. The door groaned as Andy pulled it open. The sound like something dying. The puppy cut shot through the gap immediately, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Andy followed, his flashlight cutting through the gloom in a pale shaft that revealed only fragments of the space, a collapsed section of ceiling, ancient machinery rusting into abstract sculptures, and footprints in the dust that looked recent. The air inside was thick with mildew and something else, something organic and wrong that made Andy's hand move instinctively toward his weapon. The puppy's barking echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, high-pitched and frantic. Andy moved toward the sound, his footsteps careful, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The warehouse was a maze of corridors and rooms, each one darker than the last, each one holding shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. But the puppy's barking was a beacon, drawing him forward, pulling him deeper into the building's decaying heart. What Andy didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the puppy had been making this journey for 3 days. 3 days of running through rain and darkness, 3 days of searching for help while something terrible waited in the warehouse's depths. 3 days of a loyalty so profound it defied every natural instinct for self-preservation. But the truth of what had driven this tiny creature to such desperate measures was still ahead, waiting in the darkness like a revelation written in blood and tears. The room Andy finally entered had once been an office. The remnants of furniture lay scattered like the bones of dead giants, a desk overturned, filing cabinets spilling ancient papers across the floor, a chair that had been reduced to twisted metal and rotting fabric. But it was what lay in the corner that froze Andy in place, that made his flashlight beam tremble in his suddenly unsteady hand. A man, middle-aged, dressed in construction clothes that were torn and filthy. He lay on his side, one leg bent at an angle that made Andy's stomach lurch. The man's face was pale, his lips cracked and bleeding, and around him on the floor were arranged several empty water bottles and what looked like torn pieces of fabric that had been used as bandages. But it was the metal beam across the man's legs that told the real story. a section of the building's infrastructure that had given way, pinning him to the floor with a weight that no human could lift alone. The puppy was beside the man, licking his face with desperate affection, whimpering in a way that sounded terrifyingly human. The man's eyes fluttered open at the sensation, and when they focused on Andy's uniform, something like hope flickered in their depths. "Help!" the man whispered, his voice raw and broken. "Please. My daughter. She's waiting for me." Andy was already on his radio, calling for emergency services, his voice crisp and professional, despite the storm of emotion building in his chest. But even as he spoke, even as he reported the situation and requested immediate assistance, his mind was racing ahead, piecing together the narrative that the scene revealed. The man had been trapped for days, that much was clear. The makeshift bandages, the empty water bottles, the way his body had begun to shut down, all spoke of a desperate struggle for survival. But the puppy, how did the puppy fit into this? "The dog," Andy said, kneeling beside the man, checking his vital signs with hands that had performed this action 1,000 times, but never with quite this intensity. "Is it yours?" The man's eyes moved to the puppy, and what Andy saw in that gaze made his throat tighten. It was love, pure and absolute, mixed with a gratitude so profound it seemed almost religious. "Poppy," the man breathed. "Her name is Poppy. I got her. Got her for my daughter's birthday. 3 days ago. Was bringing her home when I heard a sound. Came in to investigate. Thought maybe someone was hurt. Beam gave way." He coughed, a wet sound that spoke of internal damage, of time running out. "Poppy could have left, should have left. But she stayed. Kept bringing me water from puddles. Kept me warm at night. And then she left. I thought she'd finally given up on me. But she was getting help. Wasn't she?" Andy looked at the puppy, at Poppy, and understanding crashed over him like a wave. This animal, barely weaned, with no training, with nothing but instinct, and something deeper than instinct, had recognized that her human was dying, had recognized that she couldn't save him alone. And so she had gone out into the rain and the darkness, into a world she barely understood, searching for help. How many people had she approached before finding Andy? How many had ignored her or shooed her away, seeing nothing but a stray puppy instead of a desperate messenger? "You're going to be okay," Andy said, though he wasn't sure it was true. The man's condition was critical, his breathing shallow, his skin taking on the gray pallor that Andy had learned to recognize as the body's surrender. "Help is coming. Poppy did good. She did so good." The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, though it felt like hours. They worked with efficient precision, assessing the man's condition, setting up an IV, preparing the hydraulic equipment needed to lift the beam. Andy stood back, watching, holding Poppy in his arms. The puppy had not resisted when he picked her up, had instead burrowed into his chest, as if she had finally, after days of impossible responsibility, found a place to rest. She was shivering uncontrollably, her small body radiating the kind of cold that came from prolonged exposure and exhaustion. Andy wrapped her in his jacket, feeling the sharp architecture of her ribs beneath the wet fur. She had given everything to save this man, had pushed her tiny body beyond its limits, had demonstrated a capacity for loyalty that most adult dogs never achieved. The paramedics lifted the beam. The man screamed, a sound that echoed through the warehouse and seemed to carry with it every moment of suffering he had endured. Then they had him on a stretcher, moving him toward the ambulance with practiced speed. As they passed Andy, the man's hand shot out, grabbing the officer's wrist with surprising strength. "Take care of them," the man said, his eyes locked on Andy's. "If I don't make it, take care of my daughter and Poppy. Promise me." Andy felt something crack in his chest, some wall he had built 3 years ago when his daughter had told him she never wanted to see him again, when she had blamed him for not being there, for choosing the job over family, for missing the moments that mattered because he was always saving strangers instead of loving the people who needed him most. He had sworn then that he would never again let himself care about anything that could hurt him this deeply. "You're going to make it," Andy said, but he made the promise anyway. "But yes, I promise." The hospital waiting room was a purgatory of fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs, of coffee that tasted like regret, and magazines from 3 years ago. Andy sat in the corner, Poppy curled in his lap, wrapped in a blanket a nurse had provided. The puppy had been examined by a veterinarian who had come as a favor to one of the paramedics. Dehydrated, malnourished, paws raw and bleeding, but otherwise healthy. Miraculously, impossibly healthy, given what she had endured. Andy's fingers moved through her fur, feeling the regular rise and fall of her breathing, and he found himself thinking about loyalty. Real loyalty. Not the hollow kind that people claimed when it was convenient. Poppy had no reason to stay with that man. No training had compelled her. No chain had bound her. She could have walked away at any moment, could have found food and shelter and the easy comfort of surrender. But she had stayed, had fought, had refused to abandon the human who had shown her kindness for the brief days of her life. How many people could claim such devotion? How many humans would have done what this puppy had done? The answer sat in Andy's chest like a stone. The surgeon appeared 3 hours later, still in his scrubs, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had just fought death to a draw. Andy stood, disturbing Poppy, who looked up with bleary eyes. "He's stable," the surgeon said, and Andy felt something loosen in his chest. "Critical, but stable. The leg is badly damaged. We'll know more in the coming days about whether we can save it. He's got internal bleeding, 3 fractured ribs, severe dehydration, and the beginning stages of kidney failure. But he's alive. Another few hours and we'd be having a different conversation." Andy nodded, not trusting his voice. The surgeon looked down at Poppy, and something softened in his tired face. "That the dog that found him?" "Yeah. Damn," the surgeon said quietly. "That's one hell of an animal. That man has a daughter, by the way. Wife died 2 years ago. The daughter just turned 9. She's in there with him now." He paused, studying Andy with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be fooled by facades. "He told me what the dog did. What you did. The world needs more of that." They let Andy see the man 2 hours later. His name was Robert Herring, and he looked like death had touched him and decided to come back later. Tubes ran from his arms, machines beeped their steady rhythm of life counting, and his leg was elevated in a complex apparatus of metal and bandages. But his eyes were clear, and when Andy entered with Poppy, those eyes filled with tears. Beside the bed sat a girl with her father's eyes and her mother's delicate features. She wore a purple backpack covered in stickers, and her small hand clutched her father's with the desperation of someone who had already lost one parent and couldn't bear to lose another. "Poppy," the girl whispered, and the puppy's ears perked up at the sound of her name spoken in this new voice. Andy set her on the bed, careful to avoid the tubes and wires, and watched as Poppy crawled toward the girl with movements that were slow but determined. The girl gathered the puppy into her arms, burying her face in the golden fur, and began to cry with the kind of sobs that contained more than just relief. They contained every fear, every prayer, every desperate bargain she had made with whatever forces controlled the universe. "She saved me," Robert said, his voice stronger than it had been in the warehouse, but still carrying the rasp of trauma. "I don't know how she knew. I don't know how she understood. But she saved me, and she saved my daughter from losing another parent." His eyes met Andy's. "And you saved us both. I don't know how to thank you for that." Andy shook his head. "I just followed her. Poppy did all the work." "No," Robert said, and there was certainty in his voice. "I saw a lot of people those 3 days, officer. Through the windows, I mean. When I still had the strength to call out. Most of them didn't even look. A few looked and kept walking. Thought I was just some homeless guy, probably. Thought it wasn't their problem. But you followed. You could have ignored her, could have just taken her to a shelter and gone home to your warm apartment. But you followed. That takes something special." The words hit Andy harder than they should have. He thought about the nights he had driven past people who needed help, telling himself someone else would handle it, that he had done his time, that he deserved to think about himself for once. He thought about his daughter, about the help she had needed that he had been too consumed by work to provide. About the small moments of connection he had sacrificed for the big moments of heroism, not understanding that love was built from the former, not the latter. What Andy didn't learn until later, what the news reports would eventually reveal, was that Poppy's journey to find help had been even more remarkable than anyone knew. The veterinarian who had examined her had found something during the checkup, a microchip, standard procedure for puppies from reputable breeders. The chip's registration led to a breeder in Sacramento, over 80 miles away. Phone calls were made, questions asked, and a picture emerged that made Poppy's actions even more extraordinary. Robert Herring had purchased the puppy just 3 days before the accident. 3 days. Barely enough time for a bond to form. Barely enough time for the animal to recognize its new owner. Yet when disaster struck, when Robert had made the mistake of investigating strange sounds in an abandoned building and paid for his curiosity with crushed legs and slow death, Poppy had stayed, had kept him alive with water she carried in her mouth from puddles, had curled against him at night when the temperature dropped and hypothermia threatened. And then, when it became clear that her efforts weren't enough, that her human was dying despite her best efforts, she had done something that researchers would later struggle to explain. She had gone for help. Not randomly, not aimlessly, but with clear purpose. She had approached dozens of people in those 3 days, barking, pulling at pant legs, trying to communicate the urgency of her message. Most had ignored her. Some had kicked at her. A few had tried to catch her, mistaking her desperation for aggression. But she had kept trying, kept searching, until she found someone who listened. Someone who followed. The behavioral scientists who studied the case later would debate what it meant. Some argued it was instinct, pack behavior, the same drive that made wolves care for injured pack members. Others claimed it was learned behavior, mimicry of human actions she must have observed. But those who saw Poppy with Robert, who witnessed the bond between them, who watched the way the puppy would rest her head on the man's hand as he slept in his hospital bed, knew it was something deeper. Something that existed in that gray space between instinct and consciousness, between behavior and choice. It was love. Simple and complicated, inexplicable and obvious. Love that made a creature barely old enough to be weaned fight for days to save a life. Love that refused to accept the easy comfort of surrender. Andy visited Robert Herring's hospital room every day for the next 2 weeks. He told himself it was professional obligation, follow-up on a case, making sure the victim was recovering properly. But the truth was more complicated than that. Something about Robert's survival, about Poppy's impossible loyalty, had cracked something open in Andy's chest. The walls he had built, the emotional calluses he had developed to survive a job that showed him humanity's worst impulses daily. They were crumbling. He watched Robert's daughter, whose name was Emily, read to her father from books she brought from school. He saw how she would stroke Poppy's fur while she read, how the puppy would rest her head on Robert's leg, how the three of them formed a unit of survival and healing that seemed almost sacred. And he thought about his own daughter, Azalea, who he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, who had sent back his birthday cards unopened, who had told him, in a letter he had memorized through repeated readings, that he had never been a father to her, only a ghost who occasionally appeared between shifts. On the 14th day, Robert was moved out of intensive care. The doctors had saved his leg, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The kidney damage was reversible with treatment. He would live, would be there to watch Emily grow up, would survive to make the thousands of small, important moments that constitute a life. Andy brought coffee that day. Real coffee from the shop Robert had mentioned liking before the accident. They sat in the hospital room while Emily and Poppy napped together in the chair beside the bed, and Robert told Andy his story about his wife, Jasmine, who had died of cancer 2 years earlier, about the promise he had made to her to take care of Emily, to be both parents, to never let their daughter feel alone in the world, about how he had been planning Emily's 9th birthday party when he decided to buy the puppy, thinking a dog might help fill some of the emptiness that Jasmine's death had left. "I almost didn't go into that building," Robert said, staring at his sleeping daughter. "Almost just walked past. But I heard what I thought was someone crying for help. Turns out it was just pipes, just the building settling. But I went in anyway. And the floor gave way, and suddenly I was trapped. And all I could think about was Emily, about how I had promised Jasmine I'd be there, about how I was going to break that promise." He paused, his voice catching. "And then Poppy started bringing me water, started keeping me warm, and I realized she wasn't going to leave me. This tiny puppy, this creature I'd only known for 3 days, had decided I was worth saving, worth fighting for." He looked at Andy then, and his eyes were bright with tears. "Do you know what that does to a person? To be shown that kind of loyalty? That kind of love?" Andy did know. He was feeling it now, sitting in this hospital room, watching this broken family knit itself back together through sheer will and the devotion of a puppy who had refused to let death win. Andy made the call on a Tuesday evening. Sitting in his patrol car during his break, his hands shook as he dialed the number he had deleted and re-entered into his phone 12 times over the past 3 years. It rang 4 times, and he was about to hang up when he heard her voice. "Hello." "Azalea," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "It's your dad." The silence that followed felt like drowning, but then she spoke again, and there was something in her voice. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. "Dad?" "I know I don't have the right to call you," Andy said, the words tumbling out in a rush he couldn't control. "I know I was a terrible father. I know I chose the job over you, over Mom, over everything that mattered. But something happened recently, and it made me realize I've been living like I'm already dead. Like I don't deserve connection or love or family, and I was wrong. I was so wrong." He told her about Poppy then, about the puppy who had fought for 3 days to save a man she barely knew, about loyalty that defied logic and love that refused to surrender. And as he spoke, he felt something break loose in his chest, some dam that had been holding back 3 years of regret and loneliness and desperate longing for connection. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Andy said. "I'm not even asking you to see me. I just needed you to know that I understand now what I lost, what I threw away. And if you ever want to try again, even just coffee, even just a phone call sometimes, I'll be here. I'll always be here." More silence. Then, "Dad, I've missed you. I've been so angry. But I've missed you." Andy felt tears on his face and realized he was crying, really crying, for the first time since his wife had left him. "I've missed you too, baby. God, I've missed you so much." 3 months later, Andy stood in Robert Herring's backyard, watching Emily play with Poppy. The puppy had grown significantly, her gangly adolescent proportions promising the elegant adult dog she would become. But she still had that same focus, that same intensity in her eyes when she looked at Robert, as if she was still keeping watch, still making sure her human was safe. Robert walked with a cane now, and he would for the rest of his life. But he was walking. Was there to see Emily blow out the candles on her 10th birthday cake? Was there to hear about her day at school, to help with homework, to enforce bedtime and sneak her extra dessert when he thought she needed it? Poppy had given him these moments, had fought for them in the rain and darkness, had refused to let them be stolen by accident and cruel chance. Andy's daughter sat beside him on the porch, her hand in his. She was taller than he remembered, almost 16 now, with her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin. They were taking it slow, rebuilding trust one coffee date, one phone call, one shared meal at a time. It wasn't easy. Years of hurt didn't heal overnight, but they were trying, and that was something. That was everything. "That's some dog," Azalea said, watching Poppy race across the yard after a ball Emily had thrown. "Yeah," Andy agreed. "She taught me something important, about loyalty, about love, about not giving up on the people who matter." Azalea squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you learned it." What Andy discovered in the months that followed, what became clear as he spent more time with the Herring family, was that Poppy's actions had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The story had made national news. Puppy saves trapped owner by seeking help, and the coverage had sparked something in the public consciousness. Donations poured in to help with Robert's medical bills. The warehouse owner, shamed by the publicity, paid for all of Robert's expenses and established a foundation for workplace safety. Emily received a college scholarship from an animal welfare organization moved by the story. But more than that, the story had changed how people saw the animals in their lives. Shelters reported adoption rates doubling. Training programs focused on building bonds between humans and dogs saw enrollment surge. And in Oakland, in Andy's district, people started paying attention to stray animals, started asking if maybe that barking dog or circling cat was trying to communicate something important. Poppy had saved more than Robert Herring. She had saved Andy, had given him back his daughter, had shown him that walls built to protect against pain also blocked out love. And she had reminded a cynical, often cruel world that loyalty and devotion and love still existed, still mattered, still had the power to change everything. The researchers never could explain exactly how Poppy had known what to do, how a puppy barely 2 months old had understood that her human was dying, that she needed to find help, that she had to keep trying even when dozens of humans ignored her desperate pleas. They published papers, conducted studies, debated theories. But none of it captured what Andy saw when he watched Poppy with Robert and Emily, that some bonds transcend explanation, that love is its own intelligence, that loyalty needs no training when it comes from the heart. On the anniversary of the rescue, Andy returned to the warehouse. It was being demolished finally, the rusted walls coming down to make room for something new. He stood in the rain. It was raining again, as if the universe had a sense of poetry, and thought about that night, about following a puppy into darkness, about finding a dying man and saving him, about how one small act of paying attention, of following instead of ignoring, had changed multiple lives. His daughter was waiting in the car, and they were going to dinner at the Herrings. Azalea and Emily had become friends, bonding over their complicated fathers and the second chances they were all learning to navigate. Robert was cooking. He had discovered a love of it during his recovery, a way to show love through the creation and sharing of food. And Poppy would be there, of course. Bigger now, almost full-grown, still keeping watch over her family with that same intensity, that same devotion. She would greet Andy with a wagging tail and memories of rain and darkness and the night they saved each other, because that was the truth that Andy had finally understood. He hadn't saved Poppy, and Poppy hadn't saved Robert. They had saved each other, had reminded each other that some things were worth fighting for, that loyalty mattered. That love, in all its forms, was the only thing that made life bearable. The warehouse wall fell with a crash of metal and dust, and Andy turned away. The past was being demolished, making space for a future that included his daughter, the Herring family, and a golden retriever who had taught them all what it meant to refuse surrender. He climbed into his car, where Azalea was scrolling through her phone, and realized he was smiling. Not the professional smile he wore on duty, but a real smile, the kind that came from a chest that was no longer walled off from feeling. "Ready?" Azalea asked. "Yeah," Andy said. "I'm ready." And he was. Finally, after years of emotional exile, after walls built and bridges burned, he was ready to live again. All because a puppy had looked at him in the rain and asked him to follow, to pay attention, to care about something beyond his own pain. Poppy had given him that gift, had given them all that gift. And for the rest of his life, Andy would carry the memory of those brown eyes looking back at him in the storm, asking him to be better than he thought he could be, to save not just a dying man but himself.